So my talk today is called Design System as Public Infrastructure, and as Hidi have introduced me, my name is Mo An Cho. I'm now head of design system for PDIS in Taiwan. PDIS is under the Cabinet Office, under the CIO of Taiwan. And previously, I worked at GitHub on their front end and led accessibility and web components effort. And yeah, Hidi took all my words. And so now I want to start by talking about digital resilience, which is why I am now doing this job. And so a little bit of a background. Last year, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, it kind of sparked a lot of conversation around how Taiwan is going to be next, because there has always been tension, cross-strait tension between Taiwan and China, and that a lot of people started to ask me if I'm like safe here in Taiwan, and that like it's gonna quickly become a war zone. And so this project was actually kind of sparked because of that, because people started to pay attention to this thing. But to me personally, this has been nothing new. I grew up with this concept of there has always been constant threats of invasion, but this was kind of a good opportunities in that we suddenly got bipartisan support to up the effort in increasing our national defense, not just on the military front, but also on the digital front. So this is why I'm here doing this now. So what does digital resilience mean? As my talk excerpt suggested, that modern warfares, a lot of them are done digitally now, be it by misinformation or psychological warfare, or like spam or that sort of thing. So we need to make sure that government websites are trustworthy. And by trustworthy, I mean that citizens should be able to go to a government website and know that it is by the government, and that they can verify information from the government website. And we also need to make sure that digital services are all usable. By usable, I don't just mean that you can like do things on it. I mean that it needs to be performant, and it needs to provide a good, consistent user experience, and that is accessible to all. And by accessible to all, I don't just mean people with disabilities. I also mean that people who are not native speakers of Chinese language, for example. We have 20 national language, and we also have 3% of migrant workers in Taiwan. And this was a problem that was especially prevalent when COVID hit, because a lot of migrant workers were exposed to exploitation because they don't have firsthand access to information about COVID. And then we also have to make sure that digital services are maintainable, and that means we need to have continuous integration. We need to make sure that we know what the tech stacks are, and we know when bad things happen, how to upgrade the systems, and we need to minimize manual intervention, because a lot of times that people are the bottleneck when it comes to security vulnerabilities. And we also need to make sure that all the digital services are recoverable. And by that, I don't just mean data recovering data. I also mean that services should be recoverable. Like, for example, when a website is brought down, how do we make sure that we have the ability to package, to have our software packaged and then upload it to a different server or different cloud endpoint, and have it recovered and be used by the citizen again. So some of the scenarios that we have been thinking about are like national emergencies. We have a lot of typhoons, we have a lot of earthquakes, we have a lot of just different natural disasters. And in those situations, we need to think about if people have limited bandwidth, or if there's a power shortage, and say if an earthquake happened, people suddenly go to the website of the earthquake detection website for information. How do we make sure that the service stay up for them, and also that the informations are accurate, and also for when communication channels get cut off, are governments still able to make decisions based on the information that we have available if we don't have a way to communicate to the area that's impacted. And a lot of times that could escalate pretty quickly. And we also think about wartime scenarios. For example, how do we recover service if data centers are out? How do we recover services when we lost multiple backups? And say, what should we do if we have limited or no outside internet access? Say if a citizen were to try to find out some up-to-date information about where are the bomb shelters, for example, do they go through Google and then try to find our website? If that's the case, then we have failed, right? Because they have no internet access to Google at that point. I also talked about data gathering for decision making. And so that also means that a lot of times that governments will need to make decisions based on how many people are in certain areas and how do we gather that information. One of the ways would be to using cell signals, but private telecom companies are not really always forthcoming with their, this is considered their trade secret. So what we need to do is ensure that we have a way for them to exchange information with us, but with privacy in mind, that all the data that transfer to us are aggregated in a way that they are anonymous. So then government agencies are able to make decisions that are to do with life and death without actually knowing sensitive information. So right now, are our government websites, digital service, trustworthy? This is a screenshot of a bunch of government websites. As you can see, they don't have a coherent language and visual language, and they are a product of every agency contracting their own website to a different vendor. So not just look, and they are also all different in terms of tech stack. Some of them are using front-end frameworks, and some of them are not. Some of them are using like 1.0 jQuery, and some of them are using Vue, and the backend stack are also entirely different. And are they usable? We do have accessibility standards written in law, but it was pretty archaic. So for example, the regulation that we do have is that public information needs to be accessible, but what constitutes as public information depends. So for example, one of the things that a lot of vendors tend to do is to put a login screen as further ahead as possible. As long as it requires your credential to view the page, then the page after the login screen don't need to be accessible. And that is a loophole that has been exploited, and we would really want to change that. And that also means it leads to an inconsistent quality and experience for the user. And that also means that for internal tools, because they are not public facing, none of the internal tools for the government employees need to be accessible. And that also poses a really big problem with regards to are people with disability able to work in the government. And we have news articles on how a lot of people, government employees with computer science degree ended up asking to take phone calls as a helpline assistant, as opposed to using what they're good at because the internal tools are not accessible. And a lot of websites are also resource draining because, I don't know, it might be a cultural thing. We like to use really big image that might take 5 megabytes to download, but it gives people the illusion that the website is very vibrant, it's keep updating, but those are not the critical information that people need. And also then, are the websites maintainable? Very much not so, because the vendors all have their own stack. So a lot of times when you want to switch vendors, you essentially have to write a new contract that rewrite the whole website. And that costs a lot of taxpayer money. And it also means that the timeline for this project will be extremely long. And for the government employees in Taiwan, there are not a lot of technical staff in government agencies, not even in the Ministry of Digital Affairs, because most of them are government employees. And there's an active brain drain in Taiwan. I think the same as the rest of the world, but the difference being that in Taiwan, the median income is lower. And so for a software engineer who wants to make more money and who have the technical ability as well as the language skills, they would pretty much like me go work for a Silicon Valley company if possible. So that's also not great. And we also lack documentation to maintain these software projects, because in the government there's not technical employees. That means the vendors don't feel like there is a need to provide documentation to the government employees because they don't know how to read them. And so we kind of got into this weird situation where even if we, the experts that got hired by the government, wants to help, we don't know where to go in to help. So that's a problem. And now, finally, to my subject, design system as public infrastructure. What I am focusing on in our group of people who are focusing on digital resilience, my focus is on design system. And to me, design system as public infrastructure means that when we build a design system, we need to put safety and resilience at the forefront, and applying engineering principles to design systems. And by that, I don't just mean software engineering principles. I mean like architecture engineering principles and infrastructure engineering principles. I personally came from, I studied industrial design, which is called product design in the UK. And we put a lot of emphasis on research and less emphasis on design and the look and feels of things, because you need to have all the information first. So let me take a bridge, for example. So when we are building a bridge, a public infrastructure like this, we need to first and foremost know what it's doing is connecting people from point A to point B, very much like a digital service. We want to allow people to do a certain task or get certain information. And once we have the purpose decided, we need to design with safety and structure integrity and material, and consider the ability for this public infrastructure to withstand time and weather. And obviously, on top of which, when citizens actually go and interact with this public infrastructure, we need to have clear signage telling them where does this lead to and how do you get off it, or where the emergency exits are. And to me, from my perspective, a lot of the design systems are focused on the top part, like what's above the bridge, but not what's under the bridge, or what's inside, what built the bridge. And I think that's the most important part that's often neglected. So we have a bunch of challenges. First of all, the lack of technical staff I've mentioned. In the government, when we contract out something, a lot of times they write the RFPs, they have a template of RFPs, but the government employees don't know what's in the RFPs. And sometimes, well, that means most of the times they don't have a way to verify what the vendor delivered to them. So for example, they could say this is accessible, or there's no way to make this pattern accessible, and they just have to accept that by face value. And there are existing systems that are very hard to change just because they have decades worth of tech debt. And it's impossible to change a vendor because there's too much institutionalized knowledge that has been lost in the process. And there's also bureaucratic process that we need to fight through. For example, when I am actually at government agencies, I have ran into this scenario where in the meeting between government agencies, they decided that the website should use a certain shade of blue because the official likes it. And for the vendor, what they care about is not to build the most, the greatest website for the citizens, but to satisfy this contract and then get the money. So then what they chose was to just use the inaccessible color, and no one really know to check that it was inaccessible. So some solutions that we have already implemented some improvements for the procurement process. Previously, it was like the lowest bidder would win the contract, but now we have flipped it and say that most contracts should have a set budget, and instead we will provide a list of checkboxes, and the more checkboxes you check, the more likely you will get a contract. And so, for example, a checkbox would be like you need to use progressive enhancement, or you need to use our government design systems. And if you do that, then you will be more likely to get a contract. And through that set of checkbox, we also want to improve awareness just in general that these government contracts for digital services are not just one-off websites that should just look good for a year or two. They are public infrastructure that should be there for decades and help citizens achieve their needs. I think that's a concept that's lacking in software development in general, in private sector as well. We see a lot of vaporware, a lot of websites that don't exist after a year because they don't think about long-term scenarios. And that's one thing that I learned from GitHub, because it's a tool that gets people, let people do their job. And so we should not ever get in people's way, and it should be reliable. And lastly, we also need to, as a government, realign to global standards. For that, for example, we have accessibility guidelines that are completely diverged from WCAG because they were legacy rules that we need to consider for local needs. But those things are now not applicable anymore. And it was also preventing us from using open source tool, from collaborating with international standards. So we are focusing on trying to see how much we can chip away from the legacy laws and try to realign with the global standards. So for the design system that we are trying to build right now, here are some of my technical objectives. First of all, it needs to be progressively enhanced. We need to make sure that it can gracefully degrade when resources are limited, when internet not as stable. We also need to have built-in internationalization support. I think I've mentioned that we have 20 national language and also a lot of migrant workers, and we need to make sure that this design system can look good in all the different languages if people were to have the resource to build different versions of the websites to localize their websites. And also provide a coherent identity so people can trust the digital services that are from the government. And also we want to have mandatory accessibility conformance report for every single component, so that for vendors, for example, they will be able to use this design system and then know that they have the bargaining chip to tell government officials that this have to do this way because the Ministry of Digital Affairs mandated that this is accessible and we need to keep using them because of this. And not just change a color to a shade of blue that someone likes. And so here's a very simple example of what we have, just to show, to make sure for us internally that a component works in different languages. And this is obviously very simple, but we do plan to do this for every single component. And so the overarching goal we have is provide a set of clearly defined development and design guidelines and a rigorously built design system that ensures digital resilience. And this sounds extremely big, and it's not something that is doable in the short term. And my personal goal is that we need to have the guideline and then document why these decisions are made, because we're considering these kind of different scenarios. And so then in the future, if someone were to take over this task, they know how decisions were made and why they need to follow these guidelines. And lastly, for adoption for the design system, I think that's a challenge that every single country faces. For us, the plan is to first provide exemplary service to demonstrate that with the new and improved guidelines, we are able to provide better and more reliable, more accessible services to everyone. And also we should be able to help vendors by saving work. Like I mentioned, they should have bargaining chip. They should be able to say I'm saving time using the design system, but this is also for the benefit of everyone. And we should also help the government workers by giving them easily verifiable criteria and save the overall digital service budget by reusing components, reusing the design system. And so one of the things that we've been doing is teaching government employees that, hey, there's a tool called Lighthouse in Chrome, or there's a browser plugin called Accessibility Insight that you can easily run and understand the results, and then tell the vendors what they're lacking. So that even if they don't have technical skills, they have something to ask the vendor with some resources. So that's all. That's my talk. Design system as public infrastructure. And I think my main point is that I think design engineering should have an equal footing in this space. Thank you. That's all.
Whoa, fantastic. Yeah, very cool how you're merging your design background with all this engineering skill and get that all to work together towards a better design system. Got lots of shout outs in the chat as well. There's some questions as well. So hopefully we'll have a few more minutes to talk about those. One question is regarding what you mentioned about migrant workers and that they need access to COVID information. Do you optimize websites to work great when used with Google Translate and such other translation tools? Is a question from Robert.
No, currently, because it might be a misnomer and it's not a great practice, but nowadays the most updated source of information are the government's Facebook pages. And so they do try their best to localize localize information in different languages, but what they have on their websites are usually PDF files that are in different languages. So currently, no.
Cool.
But sorry, what we have been doing is to also make sure that social media presence of our government agencies are accessible. For example, what we have started doing is to make sure that they all have alternative text attached to them. And I think during COVID, they've also learned that they need to provide information in different languages.
Yeah. Cool. Then there's another question, which is not a question, but a shout out. Someone says, it's an amazing talk. Thank you for all you do for Taiwan. And the shade of blue that official likes is so relatable. So that's cool. I wanted to read that out. Someone else said, love the resilient setup and objectives. A question then from Fanny's. What areas do you focus on to make sure a given site stays online in one way or another long term? As in more than 10 years, as it was mentioned.
Ooh, long term. Sorry, because for staying online, I feel like that seems more of a HA problem and less of a long-term issue. Could you clarify?
Yeah, maybe Fanny can clarify it in the chat, and we'll get back to that later. One more question. So you talked about limited bandwidth due to earthquakes and typhoons. We don't really have those here. Well, we have light earthquakes. The Dutch people will know. Very light. Question about that is, how do you kind of optimize for resilience in low bandwidth situations?
Well,
from Robert.
From my point of view, is that website resource consumption should be really low. And that's done through progressive enhancement and making sure that we lazy load images, that sort of things, like pretty standard industry practices. And also making sure that we don't have massive data queries all the time. Yeah, that sort of thing. Sorry, I feel like I didn't answer the question really.
That's cool. Sometimes people say, like, can you do progressive enhancement on like big websites? What do you think?
I think it depends on what you mean by big websites. I think like GovUK does this very well, and different services might require different level of complexity. I think it's a matter of breaking them down and not like make the decision based on this one part of this website needs to be really interactive. Therefore, the whole website needs to be built with a framework.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We also emphasize a lot on caching for static pages. And so it's not just about building things in the progressive enhancement sense, but also heavily cache static pages when that's possible.
Cool. We've got a question from Jessica Lord. You put her hand up. Do you want to ask it yourself? Jessica? I think you can just unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to do an emoji reaction and I hit the wrong button. Mulan, I don't have a question. Great talk.
Thank you.
Oh, I see now the lower your hand.
I love it. I think we may have one more question if you have time, because we're going a little bit over time. There's a question from a designer, Laura. Can you talk a little bit more about the collaboration between designers and developers, especially when it comes to accessibility? How do you handle all the different aspects of accessibility? Does everyone you work with have a deep understanding of accessibility standards?
Okay, I wouldn't say so. Currently, everyone I work with do have a really deep accessibility understanding because I work with one person. Because we're at the very beginning of this project, and what we have decided is to make sure the guidelines very clear, and then make sure that the people we hire are people who have accessibility in mind. For example, we are working on growing this team, and the first and foremost criteria are accessibility, and basically we hope to set this bar by example. My partner in working with the design assistant and writing the conformance report is someone who has been in the accessibility industry in Taiwan for 3 decades. So that's something that we have been actively working towards, and also trying to make sure that we hire people with disabilities to also challenge the very this might be bad to say, but the ABOID system that, like I mentioned, the internal tools that are not deemed to need to be accessible, for example. And that's also all the areas that we need to challenge currently. So it's not easy, definitely.
Yeah, so one more question someone asked was, can they have the slides afterwards?
Yes.
Cool. We'll make sure that that's shared. I think this is all we had time for. Thank you so much, Juan, for sharing all your wisdom with us today.